Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar titled How to Reliably Monitor Attainment and Progress in and Across Key Stage 2. I hope that you can all hear me okay and you should be able to see the first of our presentation slides on your screen. My name's Heather Giggs and I'll be hosting today's webinar. We're joined today by Jemma Coulton, who joined NFER's Centre for Assessment in 2013. Jemma has worked on a range of test development, mostly focused on reading assessments, including developing national curriculum reading tests for Key Stage 1 and teacher skills literacy tests for the Standards and Testing Agency. Jemma has also managed the development of NFER reading tests for years 3, 4 and 5 since 2014. Hopefully you're familiar with the National Foundation for Educational Research, NFER for short. We've supported the education community for over 70 years through reliable research and assessments. Just so you know, our popular NFER tests for years 3 and 4, which have already been used by thousands of schools, we'll be talking a bit about those in this presentation as well. The webinar should last for around 20 minutes and we've got 10 minutes set aside for questions. Before Jemma begins, I just wanted to cover a little bit of housekeeping. You should be able to see a control panel in the right-hand side of your screen. You can use this to expand the screen view and also ask questions. Do feel free to minimise it if it's in your way, but you just need to use that if you want to ask us any questions at the end. We would ask that you can keep questions to the end of the presentation. You can do so by just typing into the control panel where you see Ask a Question for Staff. We'll get through as many as possible. If we don't have time to answer all of them, then we will follow up afterwards. All questions will be anonymous. It will only be myself and Jemma that see them, but we will read them out loud so that you know that we're responding to your question. If you're having any trouble hearing our speaker at any time or having any technical issues, again, you can use that control panel to raise your hand. I will do my best to try and solve any issues without disrupting Jemma. I can't see any at the moment, so I'm assuming that everything's okay and you can hear us all right. Just be advised that we will email you the slides and a recording of the presentation as well, so you can keep notes to a minimum if you wish. That's everything from me. So I will pass over to Jemma, who's going to talk more about monitoring attainment and progress in Key Stage 2.
Thanks, Heather. So first I'm just going to summarise how standardised assessments can be used briefly. So they can help teachers to reliably identify strengths and areas that might require additional support for their pupils. They can also enable benchmarking of individual and cohorts, so that's a class or a subgroup, performance against the national average. Finally, they can give results which can be monitored year on year, which can help you tracking progress in different subjects with your pupils. But what are standardised assessments? So a standardised assessment is an assessment that's been through a large-scale, rigorous, nationally representative trial. And there are three really important aspects of a standardisation trial. Firstly, there's that the sample itself is large and that it's nationally representative. And what that means is you have a large number of pupils, usually around 1,200 pupils per test, and that the sample is nationally representative, i.e. that it has a range of different school types, so for example, primary and junior schools or free schools, that we take schools from a range of areas across the country, and then we also have a range of Key Stage 2 performances. Now this is really, really important because it lets us say that the sample we are using in our trial is representative of the population as a whole. Obviously it's not feasible during development to trial the test with every single school in the country, so by having this representative sample we can then make inferences about the data that we have from the trial. Another really important aspect is that the tests are trialled at the right time of year. So if you have a test that's intended for use in the summer term, you should trial that with pupils who are in the summer term at the time of the trial. Now that's important because obviously a pupil's skills and knowledge and ability changes throughout the year. And if you have two different groups between your trial and your final test, the outputs might not be very reliable or useful really for teachers. Another aspect of that is when there has been a new curriculum implemented. It's really important that the test is trialled with pupils who have been taught the new curriculum. Obviously, with the huge changes to the curriculum that came out in 2014, trialling a test with pupils who were taught the old curriculum and then using that test with pupils who were taught the new curriculum can mean that some of those scores are not really that useful in telling you how your pupils are doing. And finally, it's important that the tests are trialled under the same conditions as will be used for the live test. So you use the same timings and the same level of support from teachers. Now, all of these mean that the data from the standardisation trial is reliable. Now, this is really important. We use this data in two ways. We use it to make sure that our items are working as we expect them to, that our final assessment is reliable and valid, and also so that we can use that data to produce standardised and age-standardised scores. And it's those scores that teachers can use to measure attainment and to monitor progress. So as you can imagine, it's really, really important that the data on which those scores are based is reliable to make sure that those scores are as accurate as they can be to really support teachers in their classroom management. So as Heather mentioned earlier, thousands of schools have used our tests for years 3, 4 and 5 since 2012. And we recently expanded our range to offer assessments for years 1 and 2. Now, this presentation will focus only on the Key Stage 2 assessments. However, one of my colleagues recently did a webinar on the Key Stage 1 assessments, which is available on the website, where she talks about how we developed those assessments and how they can be used to measure attainment and to monitor progress in years 1 and 2. So if you are interested in those, that webinar is available on the website. So to talk a bit about our standardisation process for our tests, we have large-scale standardisation trials for all of our tests, usually between 1,200 and 1,500 pupils taking each test, and that gives us really reliable data. And we use a sample that is nationally representative, as I described earlier. We also trial with all types of schools. We don't just use NFER customers, we use a range of different school types. We also have a dedicated team of markers, and this is really important actually in refining and developing the mark scheme during that trial so that by the time the tests are published and used by teachers, that mark scheme is user-friendly and clear and concise. So just to give a bit more detail about NFER's Key Stage 2 standardised assessments, we currently have termly tests, so for autumn, spring and summer, in reading, maths, grammar, punctuation and spelling. Now all of those tests are fully aligned to the 2014 national curriculum in England, and as I mentioned earlier, they have been trialled with pupils who were taught the new content. They are re-standardised as necessary to provide updated norms. So as the curriculum begins to embed in schools, it's important that we keep updated with how pupils' performance might change. They've all been developed by researchers with extensive experience and expertise in the development of the national curriculum Key Stage tests for both 1 and 2. So we're aware of the format of the national curriculum assessments and what are the important elements in their design and their coverage of the curriculum. And we can make sure that those important aspects are followed through to our own tests. And that's really important in making sure that pupils are prepared for their end of Key Stage 2 assessments. And finally, they are extensively reviewed and trialled to make sure they are reliable and valid. So this table just gives a little bit more information about our maths and reading assessments. As you can see, there are 3 assessments for each year, an autumn, a spring and a summer test. They all mirror the format of the Key Stage 2 tests. However, the autumn tests do contain some content from the previous year. Now this is important in making sure that they're an appropriate level of challenge for pupils at the beginning of the year. As you move forward through to the tests in spring and summer, the amount of information from the previous year will reduce. How this is reflected in the reading tests is that the autumn test has easier texts as the first test in the booklet to really engage and motivate pupils at the beginning of the test. So the spring tests both have diagnostic guidance in them in the teacher guides, which we hope will support teaching and learning. I will talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. The summer tests both have a measure of age-related expectations, and again, I'll talk more about that later in the presentation. The maths papers each test has 3 individual papers. That's 2 reasoning and 1 arithmetic, and pupils do all 3. For reading, there is a reading answer booklet and an associated separate reading booklet that contains the texts. And this is the format of the end of Key Stage 2 assessments. So in that way, we are mirroring that format. So looking at grammar and punctuation, again, 3 tests per year, mirroring the format of the Key Stage 2 tests, and all tests including diagnostic guidance in teacher guide. Now, spelling does have 3 tests per year. They're slightly different in that they're not linked to a specific term, but are interchangeable and can be used at any point during the year. They can also be used in any order, and they all have diagnostic guidance in the teacher guides associated with each test. So I'm just going to briefly go through this slide, which talks about how you might use those different termly tests. The autumn term test can be used as a baseline measure for the year ahead, but it can also be used at the end of the autumn term to monitor progress within the first term and consider areas where you might need further development for your pupils. Similarly, they can be used formatively in the spring and summer terms to monitor progress and inform next steps, but they can also be used at the end of the summer term as a summative assessment of the year's achievements and also as a way of measuring progress year on year. So, looking at the test outcomes, you will firstly get a raw score for each of your pupils, which is their number of marks they get out of the total number of marks. For example, they might get 15 out of 20. Now, once you've got that raw score, you can generate standardised and age-standardised scores. So a standardised score show how well a pupil is performing against the national average. Now, this is more useful than a raw score as it can be compared across different tests, different years to show progress and can help benchmark pupils' performance nationally. This is why when we were discussing earlier about the nationally representative sample at the trial, it's really important that that sample is representative because the standardised score assumes that by taking a representative sample of the population, we know how the whole population will perform and we can compare your pupil in your class's performance against the whole population. So having really reliable data makes sure that you've got really accurate standardised scores at this stage, which is really important since this is what your measuring of attainment and also your monitoring of progress is based on. Age standardised scores are similar, except that they, as the name suggests, take into account age. So they compare pupils with all other pupils with the same age in months nationally. That's useful where you may want to look at the performance of your summer-born pupils, for example, who, when you look at their standardised scores, may look like they're doing not as well as their older classmates, but actually for their age, they may actually be doing very well. So that just gives you an additional spectrum of information. We then have a measure of age-related expectations, which is included in the reading and the maths summer tests, and I will talk more about that shortly. We also have 2 elements of formative information. This can be through the diagnostic marking guidance that I mentioned, but also through item analysis spreadsheets, which I will go on to talk about shortly. So, age-related expectations are a measure of how well pupils are performing against the standards set out in the national curriculum. So the curriculum sets out what pupils are expected to be taught in each year, and this measure can demonstrate how well pupils are performing against this target. So this is different than a standardised score, which indicates how well pupils are performing against other pupils nationally, rather than against a specific curriculum. So as you can see here on this slide, this shows the age-weighted expectations for one of the NFER tests. I believe it's the Year 4 maths tests, and that there are 3 categories. So those pupils who are scoring, and this is their raw score on the test, between 0 and 46, are not achieving age-related expectations on this test. Those who are scoring between 43 and 69 are achieving age-related expectations on the test, and those who are achieving between 67 and 95 are showing a high achievement on the test. Now you will notice that there's some overlap between those categories, and that is because for those pupils that are on the border between two groups, we think it's really important that teachers look at their wider performance on their day-to-day work and then on the other teacher assessment to really decide which category is most appropriate for them. Okay, so this slide shows an example of the diagnostic guidance, and this is an example from a spelling teacher guide, and this kind of outlines some of the information you can expect with the diagnostic guidance. As you can see here, it shows the percentage of pupils in the trial who got this spelling correct, so this is dedication. It also shows how pupils are answering. In this case, the common error, the error with the spelling pattern that pupils are showing most commonly, and gives a little bit more detail there. It also gives other words with this spelling pattern to try and inform learning and how pupils can practice this specific pattern and try and reduce this error. Now the format for the different subjects varies slightly, but this just gives an example of the type of information you can expect to see in our diagnostic guidance. There are several other analysis tools that are provided along with the NFER tests that can help teachers to measure attainment and to monitor progress. Firstly, we have the item analysis or question grid spreadsheets, as I mentioned earlier, and these allow teachers to examine class, subgroup or individual pupil level performance on each question in a test in comparison to the standardisation sample. So I have a quick screenshot here of one of the spreadsheets. This isn't the whole spreadsheet, just gives you a picture of what this looks like. It is Excel based. As you can see, you can enter your pupil's name in the left-hand side and their marks. And on the top row, you can see the questions. And here you've got the average mark of the class, the average mark of the standardisation sample, and also the difference. And there you can see that questions where your class is performing significantly worse than the standardisation sample are automatically highlighted in red. But this also can show particular areas of strengths and particular questions where your pupils actually might be doing better than the national average. What's not shown on this screen, because it's only a screenshot, is that this spreadsheet will also show your class performance in different aspects of the curriculum. For example, you can see how your class is performing on inference questions in a reading test. And this can help teachers to identify particular areas of strengths and weakness in their class or in particular subgroups. Going back to this slide again, the progress monitoring tool is an Excel-based tool which helps to store and to automate some of the score calculations. So in the progress monitoring tool, if you enter your pupil's name, their date of birth, their date of test and their raw score, it will automatically calculate their standardised score, their age standardised score, and where appropriate, their age-related expectations category. Now this does save time. It does mean teachers don't have to do this by hand, although you can do that if you prefer and that information is given in the teacher guides. But it's also a way of storing this information so you can begin to monitor pupils' progress across tests, across subjects and across years. But as well as that, the progress monitoring tool can actually generate a couple of useful graphs which can help to visually represent pupil attainment and progress. And here is an example of one of them. So this is for a single pupil who has taken the year 3, 4 and 5, in this case I believe it's the reading tests, for both autumn and summer. And as you can see looking at the black diamonds, this represents their standardised score on each of the assessments. And as it's around 100, this is a pupil who is performing at average as against the national sample at each of the points going across the years and going across the different terms. So this is a pupil who is showing average attainment in each test. It is also showing average progress, test to test and year to year. But this graph also shows the age-related expectations categories. As you can see by the coloured bars, this represents those categories that I showed a slide on earlier. And again, here you can see that on the summer tests, this particular child is achieving age-related expectations for year 3, year 4 and year 5. Now this is a second figure that can be generated using the progress monitoring tool, and this is kind of indicative of the kind of information that can be provided by the progress tool. This is a very simplified version, just as a caveat. But this shows a class. Each of the blue diamonds represents a pupil in the class. It could be a subgroup if that's how you'd like to do your analysis. And the x-axis shows the standardised score on an autumn test, in this case a maths year 4. And the y-axis shows their standardised score on a summer test, in this case maths year 4 again. And as you can see, this demonstrates which pupils are making more than average progress and which pupils are making less than average progress. And it's not just showing those pupils who are working about average, it's also showing that, for example, at the bottom of the graph, your lower achieving or lower attaining pupils can actually be making more than expected progress. So these charts are helpful not only for teachers, but are also a really good way of visually representing what is actually quite complex pupil attainment and pupil progress to other stakeholders, including teachers, parents and governors. Now the progress tool is currently in further development, and the next update will be released in May. And this will convert the Excel-based tool to a web-based tool, hopefully to make it even easier for teachers to use and to enter their data and to get the information they want. There will be further developments going forward in the year, including further analysis, outputs and graphs. So we hope to really develop the amount of these automatically generated figures that you can get out of our progress monitoring tool to really help support you in measuring attainment and monitoring progress. Okay, so that was just a quick run through our tests, and I'm now going to show you some sample materials. Now these are all available on the website. And there is a link at the end of the presentation if you want to go and look in more detail, but we're just going to do a quick run through now. So firstly, here we have a reading sample material. I should say this is not a text from the actual test, but again is a sample that's indicative of the type of text we would include in our tests. As you can see, it's colourful, it's engaging, we match the design to the content of the text. As with the end of Key Stage 2 tests, the text in the reading booklets are not themed, so we are matching the format of the end of Key Stage 2 tests. There are a range of question types. All questions are aligned to the national curriculum content areas, and that information is in the teacher guides. So in the teacher guides, next to each question's mark scheme, we show what curriculum content area this question is assessing. Again, this is an open question to demonstrate a different aspect of reading comprehension. And for these types of questions in the teacher guide, we try to give really clear mark schemes to help teachers to mark these answers, which can be more difficult. Moving on to grammar. Again, we match the format at the end of Key Stage 2 assessments, and again, they are all aligned to the national curriculum. We have multiple choice type questions, as this one is. And we also have slightly different formats, again to keep the test engaging, but also to prepare pupils for the types of questions they might see in the end of Key Stage 2 assessments, and therefore to allow them to demonstrate their understanding the best that they can. Moving on to maths, as you can see, many of the maths items have diagrams included in them, as you might expect of a maths assessment. That helps really motivate pupils and put the questions in context. Again, there are different item types. and they are all aligned with the national curriculum and in line with the end of Key Stage 2 assessments. This is one where there is a working space, and we try to clearly lay that out so we can really scaffold pupils so they can understand how they should answer and that they should give some working, for example, in this case.